This panel is going to discuss the growing use of cyber capabilities to achieve strategic goals and how that's outpaced the development of certain cyber norms of behavior. This has increased the opportunity for some miscalculations and misperceptions that could ultimately lead to escalation and kinetic war. This panel will outline alternative approaches to creating norms of behavior in cyberspace and identify overlaps where they exist. Much current work has been done by the experts on this panel in negotiating these very norms that have been mentioned numerous times today. With that, I'd like to hand it over to the moderator, Jim, and thank you for taking over.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks to everyone for sticking around for the last panel of what's been an exciting day. We're going to not introduce the panelists. Their bios are in your handouts, but they're all leading experts in this field, which will hopefully make my job a little easier. In 1998, Russia proposed a cybersecurity treaty. It was a bit premature, right? And for about a decade after that, people kind of roamed in the wilderness trying to figure out what a good approach to international coordination to build stability and peace would look like. In the last few years, though, as you've heard from speaker after speaker, we've seen remarkable progress. I would say, for me, the cornerstone of that progress is really the UN's group of government experts, which has set the global framework for much of what we've done. But there's been many other groups that have been involved, lots of progress. So what I want to talk about is not where we were. Good things have happened. I want to talk about how we move ahead. And of course, there are a couple challenges to moving ahead. There's many challenges to moving ahead, let's be frank. So maybe I can start. The format will be, I'm going to ask a question, we'll go down the row, and the panelists will respond to that question, putting out their points of views. And I'm going to start by saying, what are the challenges to norms development that we've seen come out over the last year, and how would you deal with them? How would you deal with the situation where we were in June of 2013 when many of the members here were able to get agreement in the UN on norms and capacity building and CBMs? That's no longer the situation we're in today. So what's changed? How do we deal with those changes? Angela, would you like to start? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Delighted to be here and also to elaborate a little bit about what the UN is doing. Sean and I were sitting at the luncheon table today, and we were wondering, scratching our heads, why is it that norms come last? We both felt they should be probably put a little higher on the radar screen, but on the other hand, it's never too late to talk about norms. And of course, in the UN, that's what we really do. We have norms. Now, as Jim has mentioned, we've had 3 groups of so-called group of governmental experts, and that means that you have a resolution in the General Assembly, member states vote on it, and they say, we will have a group of governmental experts, X number, it used to be 15 for the 3 previous groups that we had. The last one concluded last year, Michele was on it, and I think she will also be on the next one, which is starting in this year. And so they come up with discussions and they come up with findings, and one of the findings was already mentioned by one of the previous speakers. Now, what are the challenges that have really come up? I think when we look at this group of governmental experts, first of all, we have 193 member states. So it's a limited group of countries that does deliberate on these issues. Always the P5 are there. They believe they're not only the P5 of the Security Council, but they naturally have to be in all of the other groups, and they will be and have been in this previous group. Now, the first group really had a lot of disagreements particularly on specific measures and also on the security implications. And then the second group in 2010 did have some recommendations, but really without much specificity. And then the third group, and I don't know if I should leave it up to Michele to elaborate on this, but really it talked about that the norms, and that was mentioned before already, derived from existing international law are applicable to the use of ICTs. It's a very significant finding, and actually one that really empowered states to continue on this and say we'd like to have another group and actually build on this. And therefore the international norms and the principles that flow from the issue of sovereignty also apply to state conduct in cyberspace. We, by the way, do not call it cyberspace, we call it information security. You know, the UN always has its own terminology, and that's what we call it. And also, the efforts to address the security of ICTs must go hand in hand with respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Again, it's a phrase, but it is really fundamental when you think about states who do participate in these foreign. Now, what are the challenges that have emerged in the last year? I mentioned already one of them, and that is it's a limited group of member states. It used to be 15 for the 3 last groups, and I basically argued very strongly with member states and said 15 is just not enough. You have to have at least 20. I would like to see it expanded to 25, but there's always financial implications which are painful, so therefore member states agreed to 20. And just on a side note, I should tell you that there is very hot contest about who should be on that group in addition to the P5. I've had more démarches from member states representatives than I have seats on this. And the other problem is that now that we've made a decision already, I've had several complaints already by those who were not selected. So that's basically one of the major issues, that it is not representative, it is 20 states. But the interesting issue is also that it has to be, the principles that and the findings of the group have to be adopted by consensus. Now that is not an easy thing to achieve among a disparate number of states with different views on these issues. And so the difficulty is also, how do you have a consensus document, a consensus agreement, but how do you then populate it and popularize it among the larger membership? So there has to be another process that goes hand in hand with this, and that is something that is ongoing. And also there has been some hints by some groupings, I should say, that maybe this isn't representative, it doesn't represent them, so therefore there needs to be larger buy-in from a larger state, it's non-inclusive. And what we need to do, and that's another challenge, is we need to turn the work of these groupings into a more universal involvement and application, and that basically needs to be looked at in terms of should it remain in a group of governmental experts, should it be brought to a larger forum, and I'm hoping that that is something that will be addressed, and I'd be looking forward to hearing also from the panelists what they think about this, whether it should move or not. There is another issue, and that is that we deal with states. But we've heard a lot today already about malicious actions, ICT actions that are done by proxies of states, for example. I don't even want to address private companies or private entities. And I think that that is something that also we need to look at. I'll stop here.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Sean, do you want to pick up? And we'll come back to some of these themes because they're essential to thinking about how you move norms forward and what the norms actually look like. But Sean, do you want to pick up the theme of challenges and ways ahead?
Thank you. As far as the procedural mechanisms and the right fora and the right topics and discussions to have, I defer to my colleagues from the UN and the US State Department who are leading and involved in those discussions. In my role, we do strategic analysis, and so my comments are going to be from an analytic and a systemic perspective. So challenges in the last year, my one word would be exigency or urgency. I think what we've observed happening in cyberspace with an increase in disruptive activities is urging us to seek norms on an even more expedited basis. I think this is a very important topic. I would concur with the speaker, Dr. Limnell, from the second panel, that we're at a critical juncture in these next few years. And I'll explain why in a moment, but I'll offer that norms are going to be set either way, depending on whether we reach them through consensus and intellectual endeavor, or if we just let things play out the way they are. And I would, of course, encourage the former. Based on the last GGE report, there was the consensus by the 15 nation states that the UN Charter and international law apply. I think that's fantastic. And the international discussion is now moving towards how it applies and how it should apply. I would offer what's really going to be important is how it will be applied in practice in real-life situations, and that, of course, is the goal of establishing norms so that those real-life events will be positively affected. I would offer that one of the great challenges is going to be moving beyond the lengthy debates about what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace, invoking Article 2.4, Article 51 of the UN Charter, and moving to what constitutes inadmissible intervention in another state short of war. Play along with me here for a second. How many of you think that nation states have been involved in cyber activities that were of a disruptive nature in the last couple years? Okay. How many of you think any nation state did that overtly and took credit for their action? I don't see any hands. Okay, I have one over here. How many of you think any nation states suffered consequences of having allegedly taken actions in cyberspace of an interventionist or other nature? Okay, I've got a couple hands, 4, 5, 6 maybe. I offer that those 3 questions and your answer to them may suggest that precedents are being set de facto and that we may be pushing towards undesired norms through practice. So I think that the discussions occurring in the international bodies to look for norms that could lead to a positive strategic equilibrium and to improved international security for all in cyberspace are terribly important, and I commend my American colleagues and our international colleagues who are all working towards that end. And I'll stop there for right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Michele?
Sean, I thought you were going to say because they were doing it regardless of the existence of norms, that norms were of no use whatsoever. But
You should take a vote on that, I suppose.
so actually, this coming GGE will be my 4th on this subject. So I've lived through all of this since 1998. Let me just give a little background of why the U.S., because it was the U.S., proposed that we affirm what are well-known norms to which all UN member states have declared their support in one way or another. In the first place, the issue was this particular GGE occurs in the first committee of the UN. It is the Military and Arms Control Committee in which issues of warfare are debated. Let us not conflate these issues with issues of governance, espionage, anything else. This has to do with the rules by which or how states deal with the prospect of military risk and possible escalation or conflict. And that's what we focused on. The Russian Federation had long proposed that we do so through an arms control approach, that is one which would have banned the development, deployment, and use by states of what they call information weapons. And they use the term information security, which is a Russian term, because it includes content in all cases. Information weapons include propaganda. Information terrorism includes terrorist speech, and information crime includes crimes of content, none of which the US recognizes. That's why we use the term cybersecurity. In any event, it was in 2009 that the US, who had opposed the notion of arms control in cyberspace as one that was not so much undesirable as unimplementable, proposed instead that all states in the GGE look at affirming the applicability of the UN Charter and international humanitarian law to state-on-state use of cyber tools. And it is that debate which has had so many fruitful outcomes over the last several years. We also proposed that practical measures be used to enhance confidence and cooperation between states. As you're all aware, there are no external observables on cyber things, unlike with respect to kinetic weapons. And the result was that unless we begin to do some transparency activities, that is, tell states what we have in mind, the lack of predictability, the problems of attribution of disruptions in cyberspace could lead to lead to unwanted escalation and the possibility of confrontation. Those are the things that we focused on. But the challenge in the future, having achieved several seminal things, as Angela has pointed out, we achieved the affirmation of all international law to cyberspace. We also affirmed, very importantly, the applicability of the law of state responsibility, and that states should not use proxies in cyberspace. Where can we go from here? It's a terrible problem. We focused on international law that all UN member states support. Where we go now could be a situation of dueling norms. Russia and China have a code of conduct that they have promulgated that would, in fact, affirm their particular views of cyberspace, and in particular that states have sovereignty over their populations with respect to the free flow of information, which would legitimize their curtailing that free flow of information. Mr. Daniel this morning talked about additional norms which a broader group of like-minded might support, including a prohibition against IP theft, a prohibition against attacking civilian critical cyber-enabled infrastructures, and several others. It seems to me that what we all need to think about when we design possible norms is how broadly they apply to the interests of all states. It will be in that context that we will be able to find a support or consensus. Also, to the extent that we are able to do some confidence-building measures or cooperative measures which show us how we can work together against cyber threats and challenges, those themselves, those procedures and processes may themselves engender norms over time. Anyway, I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you. Heli, thanks for doing a second panel, but it's important to hear what the European Union is thinking about this.
I was just thinking that I'm doing disclaimer now and saying that everything which I'm saying doesn't represent the official
Okay, so it's not important to hear what the...
Well, I start with the European Union and then I do the academic part, if it's possible. Well, I think it's absolutely amazing that has happened since 2007, 2008 in terms of developing cyber norms. Since I have a unique background of coming from Estonia, where we saw the need for some kind of restriction for state behavior in this new domain already quite early. And then we started to push this in several multilateral fora. And now, in 2014, we can say that we have adopted first set of the confidence-building measures in cybersecurity in OSCE. And it has been, I think, a great success, and we owe possibly great thanks to the US as leader in this process in the OSCE. Having said that, it's just a start. It's a very good start, but it's just a start. And we need to do a little more, a lot more maybe, in long run, to make sure that there is a shared perception of risk among the nation states. Also, the first set of norms that we now have adopted in OSCE only comprise 50-something participating member states, and there are large countries in the world which are not part of this group. So we would possibly foresee that norms for the state behavior should be extended in other fora. For instance, the Asian Regional Forum, where some other important nations are part. And that would be coming up in our working plan. Well, as all other speakers here have said already, with the norms process, we try to avoid the situation that we give in to some sort of cyber treaty, because the cyber treaty would be used to curtail freedoms, and that's what we do not want to have. And therefore, the norms process is the only way right now what we see as a way forward to maintain the stability of cyberspace, at the same time preserving and guaranteeing the rights and freedoms in the free internet. So, however, we know that some of the countries in the world would like to twist the norms debate together with internet governance and try to mix all these different issues together in one basket. And not many countries in the world understand all these differences and international cyber diplomacy in such a nuanced way that are able to discuss all the nuances in multilateral fora. And this makes our task a little harder, because we, the European nations, together with the US and other like-minded, we try to really hold the line and say, well, we should not really go towards this treaty-based approach, but we should stay with the norms. And having said that, I think the norms process should really continue, and EU is a very strong supporter of cyber norms when it comes to state behavior and also the applicability of current international law in cyberspace. So this is official EU position that has been articulated in the EU cybersecurity strategy adopted in 2013, also in the Council conclusions adopted in June 2013, and therefore we are happy that EU and US are exactly on the same page on this issue. But if I now may, to go on with a little more academic research question here, because we are in the university. So, I think in long run, the norms debate possibly has to extend outside of state-centric mode. And it has started with state-centric mode because this was the first necessity, really, to make sure that the big building blocks of international system are behaving according to some sort of set of rules. And in order to decrease misperceptions and possible misinterpretations and to have some common ground, this was absolutely necessary to start with the state actors when instilling cyber norms. But however, when we look at cyberspace, so then we see, as it has mentioned here before, majority of the actors are non-state actors, private sector actors, civil society, end users, so on. And therefore, we might have this intellectual exercise at some point together with the research community and academics, how we could maybe shape the second layer of norms after the first very important layer of state behavior and political military issues. And the second layer maybe would entail, for instance, the economic aspect of cyber norms. So we might start thinking of intellectual property rights, maybe some international trade context together with IPR, because when we just look at the cybersecurity, in the end we end up with economic issue. And once we tie up cyber norms to economic behavior, and why not use the existing organizations like WTO or the other trade regimes, then we might see a new avenue there where the cyber norms get integrated into the existing economic norms, rules, standards, however we call them. The same might happen with data protection and privacy rights. It has a very strong economic context and dimension. And when it comes to critical infrastructure and protecting the core infrastructure, so we might maybe end up with some early warning norms or information sharing norms at some point where the critical infrastructure players all over the world have to share warnings or about the malware they have found in their systems, for instance. It's an academic exercise now, as I said. Then we might also think about the norms assuming minimum responsibility for criminal acts emanating from territories of certain countries. The states due diligence has been actually also touched with the recent UNGG report when it comes to how was it framed,
State responsibility.
State responsibility, yes, when it comes to the actions that might be harmful for the other states. And when the criminal elements are becoming more prevalent, and we know, most of the cyber people, we know that the question of cyber safe havens and the question of territories where the criminal infrastructure might be hosted and is moving out is becoming more and more critical for all the law enforcement actors. So then we might think of some sort of technical norms for different sectors that are part of the larger system of digital ecosystem, software, hardware, ISPs, telecom backbone, internet functions. So it's becoming technical, so I'm not going into this. And then we might think about norms, what the countries have to do in order to build up the cyber system on their own, like a national resilience type of cyber system. So I think I'm just doing academic exercise. What could be the next debate after the state-centric approach to the norms?
It's not fair, however, Heli, for you to answer my questions before I ask them. So I'm going to ask the rest of the panel pretty much what you've already answered, which is we've taken, to some extent, a disarmament approach to the development of cybersecurity norms. That's why it's in the first committee. It's been most successful there, and in many ways that made the most sense and continues to make the most sense. But when we think about the role of cybersecurity and disarmament, how does cybersecurity fit into the larger disarmament agenda? And how do we think about moving beyond it? Because this is in some ways a unique problem.
Can I finish?
I thought you were done. It is a unique problem because we have civil actors involved in ways even beyond what we see in non-proliferation. So you can finish by answering that question, and then we'll go reverse down the panel with Michele next.
Because when I started to talk about the national maturity of cyber systems and cyber readiness, I think Melissa has been doing great work on this, for instance, and some other people. So we might start off thinking on maybe rating countries according to the cyber readiness index, and so maybe at some point there is an economic incentive for these countries to actually prove that they are cyber ready, and maybe investments and economic decisions will be tied up to this index at some point. And of course, then it is becoming already the investment and business strategy issue. And then, very importantly, we have all one responsibility, or how, I don't know how to approach this, that not all the nations in the world actually are in that maturity level of thinking about cyber readiness norms and so on, and how we close that gap so that the developing nations that are just starting to use the benefits of connectivity actually would also benefit in the future, so that all this criminal infrastructure does not end on their territories and start maybe inhibiting their own economic and social development. So I think the developed nations have clearly a responsibility there to fill that gap and to invest into the cybersecurity capacity building outside of the developed world. And that's what the EU very seriously now is concentrating on. So in a nutshell, and answering your question, so how we move beyond the debate of arms control, state-centric norms, we might think of economic aspects, then we might think of minimum state responsibility as for the due diligence for criminal or addressing cybercrime. Then we might think of the technical functional areas to protect the global information infrastructure. And then we might think of the national responsibilities of states, but not only states, but also the public-private partnerships and the local cyber ecosystem, because we know everybody who has built up the cyber system in their own country knows that the state as such or government as such is a small player most of the critical assets belong to the private sector.
I don't know about
so
that.
this-
We can come back to that one, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's, I think, something that we might think. And of course, I had something about human rights and privacy and civil society in the end. Well, I will
You
skip
can come back to that one.
Yeah.
Let's,
Okay. So
Michele,
I finish now. Yeah.
perhaps you can...
Question?
Do you want me to remind you the question? Yeah. How do you move beyond arms control when there's so many other actors? Arms control, I think, remains the appropriate venue to center much of our discussion, but there's clearly, as Heli has said, a lot more going on.
I guess I would take issue with the claim that just because we're in the first committee that, and the Russians proposed an arms control approach, that we conceded that approach. I mean, certainly confidence building measures have a long history in arms control. But before we contemplate how many hundreds of norms we can all come up with to try to make the cyber world right, I would simply ask that we all contemplate what the outcome is that we are seeking. And I certainly concede that there are many actors in cyberspace. As a State Department diplomat and representative, my focus has been and will be on state actors simply because of the degree of damage that might be done to all of our countries, and that I deal with other countries which, despite the claims of the borderless nature of cyberspace, still seem to have a large stake in where it's going. To answer my own question, I have posited an end result of these efforts of norms, confidence, and cooperative measures as a state of equilibrium or stability where states do not have a particular incentive to attack one another. And the question is, how do we get there? Certainly the norms that we've talked about that we've already affirmed in the GGE, and I think, as Heli noted, have been also affirmed in OSCE. And I suspect if you pinched most of the member states of the UN, they would affirm that the UN Charter applies. And I think that is something that we might do. But how do we achieve this equilibrium or stability situation? And I would probably say that at a certain point, if we do achieve confidence, we will be looking at issues of self-restraint. And if self-restraint comes under the rubric of an arms control-like of activity, I think that that's where we might be heading. So you might ask the question, what are the activities that states might do that are highly destabilizing? I would remind of the analogy of an old US-Soviet agreement in 1972 called the Incidents of Sea Agreement, where we were banging into each other on the high seas. We were playing chicken and naval aircraft were getting damaged. And we undertook an agreement not to do certain things which might in fact eventuate in open hostilities, such as not feigning attack or not flashing the bow of the other ship, things like that, giving way. Those types of activities, if you could analogize them to cyberspace, may be the types of things that we might want to consider. They may be very different than that. They may be activities where we do not mess with the internet infrastructures. We don't divert internet traffic in a way that might be harmful to another state. But I would ask all of you to think about this, because we certainly haven't cornered the market on good ideas in this area. So I'm sorry, Jim, if I haven't broken out of my arms control kind of mindset. And the other model that one might think about, and I think I talked about this a couple of years ago when I was here, which is that we have something called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is a voluntary regime of those states who abhor the proliferation of fissile material and have pledged to interdict ships and other types of transport where that material is being illegally proliferated. One might think of a voluntary group of, hopefully a large group of like-minded who do not like disruptors in cyberspace and may ultimately agree to act together to isolate, sanction, or stop somehow those in the future who seek to disrupt cyberspace. So I would leave you with those thoughts.
I'd say the one issue we have that maybe the next two speakers can address, or we can come back to it, is since the people who are involved in these activities go beyond states, what's the answer for how you involve civil society? But we can come back to that one. Sean, why don't you go ahead and go back to the question of arms control, good place to start, how do we move beyond it?
I would also caution against purely invoking traditional arms control models or notions. I say that because I think cyber security and cyber operations issues are becoming a part of statecraft and therefore inherently intertwined with almost every other geopolitical and disarmament or other issue. I think they are involved in both the perpetration and the interdiction of almost all your national security concerns increasingly. When I say they are ICTs, this is how you do almost everything in your life and how you directly or indirectly, and how you try to find out what other people are doing directly or indirectly. So why do I contrast it with traditional biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons modeling? I would offer that the technologies we're talking about are ubiquitous, and they are completely dual use that we're using in every part of our life, like you heard Mr. Charney and Mr. Inglis mention in the previous panel. I think most of you are well aware of the difficulties of attributing things in cyberspace, which makes monitoring and verification incredibly difficult compared to some of the procedures we had for nuclear deterrence in the Cold War. The cost of entry into this space is incredibly low to have potentially cascading effects and asymmetric effects. And the traceability of some of these technologies is incredibly difficult. We're not talking about counting missiles, eradicating anthrax or smallpox samples, eliminating the substrates of poison gas, or recycling certain fissile materials from military to commercial energy uses. We're talking about trying to constantly monitor very ethereal and ephemeral capabilities that are constantly changing with time, and that makes it an incredibly tall order. Not to say those other challenges weren't tall orders, but this one might even be more challenging. I don't have an answer for you about how we're going to do that, but I will tell you I see 4 aspects of what any successful effort towards a strategic equilibrium and norms is going to require. I think it's going to need to be universally applicable, and that doesn't mean perfectly symmetric, okay? We do have symmetric models like the UN Charter Rules and the Geneva Conventions. My colleague Michele also mentioned the PSI, and you have the NPT treaty, which are not perfectly symmetric across all countries, but they seek to achieve a security equilibrium for the whole world. Secondly, I think they need to be transparent, these norms, and by that I mean they need to be well-known and very clearly stated. Not that that means everything will be perfect, black, white down the road, but the rules need to be known, and I think that's what some of the international engagements are leading towards. Third, I think we need to work somehow towards enforceability, and whether that is a small cadre of nations who enforce them or whether it's universal jurisdiction to enforce it. I think there needs to be some way for people who breach those norms or breach those, if they end up being arms control measures, that they can be held accountable. And last, I think it needs to be stable of some sort, such that all parties think they have a vested interest in supporting that regime, whatever it may be, because it leads to their specific security in addition to the greater security. I won't bore the non-mathematicians in the room with the concepts of Nash equilibrium and Pareto efficiency, but I think you're going to need to apply those the same way they were a central part of the discussions and the game theory analysis during the Cold War and other deterrence conversations. With all due respect, I'll abstain from suggesting what civil society should do because that is well beyond the ambit of my government role.
Thank you, Sean. Angela.
Thank you. The advantage of being the fourth speaker means that a lot has already been said, and I do agree with all of it, so I can be fairly short. Does it fit in the disarmament agenda? No, I agree that it doesn't really fit. But on the other hand, as Michele pointed out, the first effort was in 1998. And so therefore, I think it was looked at as something that was more like a military application, just like outer space, militarization of outer space, militarization of cyberspace. So therefore, that's how it ended up in the first committee. But let me remind you, the first committee does not only deal with disarmament, it deals with larger peace and security issues. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. It could be, maybe a threat to international peace and security. And that is something that we really are addressing here. Is it the perfect venue for it? No, but you have to put it in some kind of a slot. And that was a slot that was found. And once it's in there, it's going to be very hard to extract it from it. The advantage is you've got 193 member states that are looking at it. Now, here's the difficulty. The previous report in 2010 was welcomed by other member states. This last one, which concluded last year and therefore went before the General Assembly in the fall, was only they took note of the findings. I do think that's significant. That may not reverberate with you, but in the nuances of the United Nations, it is significant because what you sense out there is that not everyone is on the same level playing field and not everyone may agree with the norms that were established. So the question is, when you look at cybersecurity and you look at the first committee, how do you improve on this? How do you actually go further? And I think one of the major problems is you've had a big win last year. So how do you improve on that? Do you have more norms? Do you make them implementable? Do you have some kind of a strategy that you come out with? And Sean already talked about like the transparency, but also he talked about enforceability in terms of the breach of the norms. I do think that that is something that will go far beyond what the next group is going to be able to do. The UN is never very good at putting forward things that can be enforced, and particularly to punish those that have not enforced it. To my mind, it's much better to look at something that is called monitoring. Let's monitor it first. I was in charge of the Syrian chemical weapons investigation last year. And basically one of the major criticisms is that we did not have findings of accountability. And why did we not have findings of accountability? Because the member states explicitly excluded that from the mechanism that we were using that was developed by member states. And I think we must keep that in mind. But what we do need to do is we need to increase the norms. We need to look at this. We need to look at implementable strategies. We need to look at something that can actually be done, and then we need to put something in place that can be monitored. Now, again, the private part, and the private part is a very large one, is a very tricky issue. The UN is a state-to-state organization. They grudgingly invite private industry occasionally, NGOs occasionally, but they give them the last speaking lot at 5:45 before the translators or interpreters stop their work. And then they have to make like 1 or 2 speakers on behalf of, the 40 NGOs or 100 NGOs that are in the room, and then they will listen, but most of them are already filing out. So we're not very good at that. And that's why initially in my first intervention, I said we need to find other fora to improve on that. But the first thing we need to do is we need to find more of the stakeholders within the member states to broaden from what was 15 to what is now going to be 20, and to also help support that from a larger stake. I give you one example. I had included in the next group of governmental experts, because this is a governmental group, I'd included a very small Caribbean country, because in the last findings, there was also the request that we have like capacity building. And again, some of these smaller countries do suffer inordinately from cyber attacks or whatever it is that might disrupt their activities. And I was already criticized from one of the P5 members to say, well, gee, they really have nothing to say on the issue. But that, to my mind, is incorrect. The only indication that we're given is that we have to have geographic representation. There have to be other voices that are being heard. And they have to also be, if I can call it that, be able to contribute to that. Otherwise, you will never going to be able to mainstream that in the UN. Thank you.
Thanks. And let me say, if people have questions, they should start migrating towards the microphone. I have plenty of questions and can fill in for you, so perhaps I'll do that now. One of the dilemmas I see, and we've heard a little bit of this in some of the previous panels, some of the previous speakers, is you are seeing competing notions of what responsible state behavior is emerge. And you are seeing different ideas of the balance between universal rights and sovereign rights. And this is a tension that perhaps we didn't expect. So how do you work in developing norms acceptable to the entire international community when you have differing definitions of responsible state behavior? How do you make progress on that? Heli, do you want to start, or do you want to?
Yeah, well, you know, I come from a common sense place, the Nordic country, and I would think the first rule would be to start from the basics. And the basics would be to get state behavior under control, to have due diligence in addressing cybercrime, to have the national system that is able to avoid a major global information infrastructure catastrophe. And it does not, it should be ideology neutral, I would think, because we might, you know, not get too far if we tie this up to ideology. It's like financial services industry, which is ideology neutral, the first layer. And then when it comes to the second, third, and other layers, then we might start, of course, thinking whether we should offer capacity building programs for those countries that would use this technology for surveillance and censorship. And then these questions actually are already at my table when I am delivering EU money now for different countries on capacity building. It's not a very hypothetical question, and it is a problem that we might not be able to help all the countries in the world, and we might to have some sort of threshold there. But I think there are those basic building blocks that we can follow. Yeah.
Thank you. Michele? And we will get to the conference organizer. How could we not take her question? But please, Michele, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I agree with Heli, and I think that what we have done, what the role that CBMs have played, are practical measures designed to address common concerns. And at least in the first committee, the common concern has been one where misattribution of the origin of an incident of national security significance leads to escalation in warfare inadvertently. So I think that there has been a common recognition, not simply among the 15 and the GGE, but the 57 and OSCE, that this is an important issue. And we also have proposals in the ASEAN Regional Forum as well for looking at CBMs. And I would divide norms from CBMs. Norms can be ideological, but if you focus on practical confidence building and cooperative measures that are designed to address common security challenges, you will find a willingness for all states to work together to the extent that they believe those challenges are important to their security as well.
If we probably won't have time, but I wondered to what extent you can remove the ideological component when much of the debate is over democratic values and human rights. But we can come back to that. If you have a quick thought.
Well, one of the reasons why we focused on the UN Charter and international law was its universality of acceptance. And I'm troubled, Angela, by your comment that in accepting in the UNGA and accepting the resolution, or in accepting the consensus report, they didn't all say yea verily, but took note of it. And I suspect that the one who insisted upon taking note was China, who we dragged kicking and screaming into affirming the law of armed conflict, and who they have subsequently said that the law of armed conflict is not international law, although I do not think that that's a universally held concept. So I'm a little jaundiced about that. I think that practical concerns about national security can make odd bedfellows that can work together on things where they may not disagree. And I think we've seen that over decades in the past. So.
For you aspiring diplomats, it turns out to be astute to have the final day of a negotiation be the day before a presidential summit. But Sean, why don't we... yeah.
He was there.
Go ahead, Sean, please.
I just want to underscore the import of this question, and I'm going to do it by reading you 2 sentences from Director of National Intelligence James Clapper's annual threat assessment to our Congress this year. Quote, Russia and China continue to hold views substantially divergent from the United States on the meaning and intent of international cybersecurity. These divergences center mostly on the nature of state sovereignty in the global information environment and states' rights to control the dissemination of content online. With that said, I would agree with my counterparts that the place to start the positive production of norms and continued production of those is at the common interest. What are the universal concerns that we all share? It is in the de-escalation. Not only the United States, but also Russia for many years has stated that as a primary concern. And you heard the term trust a lot this morning. Well, I think it applies between the nation states as well in the confidence building measures. That's the purpose of these efforts at norms. So what I would suggest is how do you move forward, and what you need to be focusing on here are fleshing out those particulars of the international law principles that apply. I'm a trained international lawyer, and it's my understanding that international humanitarian law or the laws of armed conflict are considered part of public international law. Secondly, fleshing out the particulars of state responsibility and how it would apply to situations, particularly where non-state actors are taking action from a specific sovereign's territory. There's already been progress in the GGE discussions about the non-use of proxies and also at the OSCE. I think that needs to be fleshed out more. So a very simple answer. Look for the common ground, build off that, develop positive partnerships, and see how it can expand for common interests in the future. That may sound incredibly obvious. Well, it is, and that's actually where most international cooperation stems from.
I must say I agree with the previous speakers, and I think it's really to look for the common ground, and I think this is why Michele also mentioned the confidence-building measures. I mean, the confidence-building measures is something positive. It's something forward-looking. It's something that you can agree on, whether it's exchanging best practices, exchanging bilaterally information between national CERTs or within CERT communities, other consultative frameworks that could be bilateral, they could be regional, they could be multilateral. But it is necessary that we move in a positive way. I sometimes really wonder because, you know, there are various fora in the United Nations, and I think it was Heli who mentioned first human rights. And of course, you know, we are very focused, very supportive. We want human rights. We want this to be implemented. But I think it is really, in my mind, not a very good idea to move, let's say, the cybersecurity issue as a human rights issue, because then you get a Human Rights Council involved, and you have a special rapporteur appointed, and sometimes these initiatives don't go in the right direction. They're more punitive than they are forward-looking. And I'm hoping that we can keep it, whether it's the first committee or what, but we can keep it in a forum that is forward-looking, that is basically creating something rather than destroying something that exists. And trust, of course, will be the one that will be left by the wayside. I would like to see some kind of a scorecard also developed, because you need to move it from the 15 or 20 to a larger community that they need to bore in. So basically, what are the capabilities? I mean, maybe there is a way of getting an inventory or something. I mean, maybe this is too much of an effort. It's also a fast-moving target, but we need to have something that we can actually measure. You know, trust is very good, but it's also, you know, was it Ronald Reagan who said trust but verify? And I think that is something that we all very strongly believe in. But there is a common good, there is a larger good there that we really need to push within the member states. And that's what I'm concerned about, that we kind of push this out and we don't have the taking note, but we actually welcome, we actually see something positive in this effort. And so I think that expanding it to even 20, even though that's only 10%, just over 10% of the membership, is already a very good effort. Thank you.
We're getting close to the end, but we have two very important questioners, so I really want to hear from both of them. Let's bear that in mind as we answer the remarks. First, Catherine, and then Melissa, please. But Catherine, go first, then we'll answer, then Melissa.
I'd have to say, The young lady behind me is much more important than myself, but I will take it as a compliment. So, first,
important in the substantive sense.
all around.
Yeah.
Thank you for actually being the last panel, and it was certainly not meant to say norms were less important. I'd have to admit they're the most dearest topic to my heart, as you all know, so I didn't do that purposefully. In fact, I probably did it so people didn't think that I was just promoting this idea while others had less important. But there's one topic, one issue has kind of plagued me from an international law perspective for a while, and since I have three of you were actually in the UNGG meetings, part of trying to gain interpretation, like value of interpretation about what was done, particularly in the last report. So I've looked and looked at the report and thought about what it means from an international legal point of view, making note, as you've said, that the UN Charter was mentioned, norm of state responsibility, and broadly international law. From an international legal perspective, a lawyer would look at that and say, there's something that's glaringly obvious to a lawyer that something's been omitted, and that would be the law of armed conflict. Typically in international law, when you talk about the UN Charter, that's half of the pie, that's the jus ad bellum, and the other half would be a jus in bello, and that'd be LOAC. So, Michele, you may have answered some of this question. You said that the Chinese agreed in the meeting, LOAC applied, and now have recently said they didn't. Because that would be helpful.
Okay, so basically what we all agreed was that saying that international law applied subsumes, there is nothing stood outside of international law. So our interpretation was that that included LOAC.
So, okay, so was there a decision made, why specifically mention UN Charter then, outside of international law?
Negotiation.
So that was actually, that point was negotiated as to the specific language?
Yes. So if you note the first paragraph of the Sino-Russian Code of Conduct, it refers to the UN Charter and affirming all of that. And then we also affirmed we would affirmed international law. So it is our position that the law of armed conflict is subsumed in the reference to international law. There was no modifier on international law.
And so as a methodological note, one way you could resolve this question is by interviewing the 15 experts who were present. And I think you would find, I think I've interviewed 7 of them since the GGE. I think you would find, unsurprisingly, that there are verbal understandings that accompany agreement, particularly in large discussions like this. But the way to answer this question might be to just ask the experts, what is your understanding of this issue? And I think you would find all but one country would have a very similar understanding. But I haven't completed the interviews, so ask me in a few months. Melissa, can we perhaps go to you?
It's hard to follow, Catherine. Thank you very much for your comments. I heard, I'm just going to replay some of the things that I think I heard, that arms control and disarmament is not the path to go, that information communications technologies are ubiquitous and that they're part of every day and the dual purpose of them are every day, and that we need to be forward-looking. So I was hoping that the panel could talk to the recent agreements with the Wassenaar Agreement and arms control, Wassenaar, and Disarmament.
Wassenaar, yeah.
Depends on which.
It's a Dutch word.
So
Sorry.
I shouldn't pronounce it like the Germans.
Yeah.
Could you please talk to the technologies that we have limited in the ICT realm due to, from a cybersecurity perspective, what that means from a forward-looking, and what other technologies might we anticipate being brought into the Wassenaar Agreement in the future?
I can probably answer a little bit of that, not all of them. One, going back to your précis to all of this, I think arms control as a concept where you have negotiated treaties is not the way to go. It is a multi-purpose, IT is a multi-purpose technology that is not susceptible. It's not visible, it's not observable, it is totally ubiquitous, and that's what I agree. I think Jim's point in asking some of these questions was the larger concepts of CBMs, for example, were used in arms control. What is a confidence building or a CSBM or a transparency measure? So I think that was the other discussion. So I am not an expert at Wassenaar, but I would note in the first instance that Wassenaar is not an arms control regime. It is an export control regime where you basically know who your end users will be by putting a technology or some piece of hardware under control of Wassenaar. And others agree to do this. I'm sure this is public information. I believe that there were 2 proposals, one from the UK and one from France, on controlling, I think one was hardware, one was software, a very narrow thing, and don't ask me what it is because I don't know nothing about it, but that it was ultimately considered a good idea to do this so that they would know where this technology was going when licensed. As for your last question about whether this is a harbinger for future types of technology control, I asked that same question. And the answer that I received was there are no plans to go down that road. Now, whether or not we want to have an understanding of where the things that we license go, whether it's under Wassenaar or the munitions control list or anything else, is a very good question. And certainly knowing where the stuff that we produce, particularly because in my view, much of the stuff that we produced in IT comes from a tradition of being unclassified, and it may merit further consideration, but my role is tangential to those issues. I've expressed interest from the State Department point of view in knowing what is being contemplated there. Does that help?
Anyone else?
Okay. I'll also make a comment on the précis and then address the question straight away. I would slightly nuance your initial comment by saying I think the arms control discussions can be helpful and informative, but they're not metaphors and analogies that can be taken and applied lock, stock, and barrel. They fall short in certain logical aspects. Speaking to Wassenaar, I'm also not a specialist in that at all, but I have read the provisions, and I would say they probably fall short on 2 of my 4 criteria. Wassenaar agreement is not applicable to all countries, so it's not universally applicable. So it would fail on that principle of mine. And secondly, I think it would be highly problematic on the enforceability and accountability issue. The last comment I'll make is a lot of the technologies that aren't on that list could be used to conduct many of the activities that many nations are concerned about. And I'm going to give one example in extremis. If you are from the Russian or the Chinese perspective, social media platforms and content itself can be the vehicle for spreading unacceptable information from their view. So unless you're going to prohibit all social media and all personal handheld devices, you're probably not going to eradicate the concerns that some nations have. So I don't think it's a solution that'll get us to where we want to be. As my colleague suggested, look to where you want to be.
I think I wanted to do exactly the same and point out that it's not a universal agreement. And we have a lot of partial agreements. And I think that sometimes they're the response because you don't get a universal agreement, so therefore you go for a partial one. But what happens is that you usually collect, if I can call it that, the like-minded states. And that leaves out a whole swath of countries that don't agree with that agreement or that don't want to join it. And I think that makes it ultimately more dangerous because they're not going to join it because they don't ideologically agree with it. And when it comes to disarmament, I mean, I said, it's not a traditional disarmament issue, but on the other hand, I do want to say that whether you have killer robots or you have drones, etc., they're becoming increasingly an important facet to our work. It is something that, no, we don't deal with explicitly, but I think that I tried to actually get interest in this in the United Nations last year already, and I was sort of told it's too early. Well, I think that a year later, the debate has really started and is heating up, and I'm hoping it'll come and have some kind of a discussion in any case, not an outcome, but a discussion. But I think that one of the concerns is the development in technologies that have potential military and security applications, because basically what a state's trying to do is you can no longer ensure security with conventional weaponry or boots on the ground. So they're looking for other ways to ensure security, and that's basically where ICT comes in. And that is something that I think we need to address.
On Wassenaar, I'd point out that the two principles that guide the regime are national discretion, which means something's on a list, you decide what you get to do with it, and transparency, albeit post facto transparency. So you're supposed to tell people when you've sold something. The fact that the US has been famously inelegant in implementing national discretion is different from the larger regime, where the problem isn't as acute. Anyhow, is that enough?
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you. Next, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Adrian Diarra, Security Studies Program here, Georgetown University. My question is regarding the multi-stakeholder approach of the Internet governance.
Could you repeat? I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I was talking about the multi-stakeholder approach.
Okay.
So you talked about the states, the necessity of having a public-private partnership. And I was wondering if you were working with some of the non-official, at least as a multilateral organization such as ICANN, on this approach today for Internet governance.
Feel free to leap in. Maybe we'll start with Heli on that one. Is that since the EU's just the Commission has just put something out on governance, hasn't it? Yeah.
Well, Internet governance, as we know this right now, has been very successful due to private sector innovation and multi-stakeholderism, and the model as such should continue. The question might be maybe to make it a little more accountable and transparent, and to include different economic players that might not be presented or represented right now there. And also sometimes the issues are very technical, and sometimes there are technical accountability issues, as I understand, with the current model, but it's not the fatal. One can always fix this short-term problem for the long-term good. And the EU position is firmly to support a multi-stakeholder model and to make it more transparent and accountable, and avoid any global solution for multilateral governance structure. Yeah.
Anyone else? No? Maybe we could build on that a little bit, just because not a very long time, but you have a lot of institutions that were created for governance and for some of the technical issues that the commercialization of the internet. Do we need similar institutions for cybersecurity, or are existing institutions in the larger security realm adequate? OSCE certainly has been adequate. What would you say on the institutional relationship?
Well, when it comes to cybersecurity, then most of the international organizations that are out there doing the political, military, international security issues, I think should do the job that they have been doing. But I'm not thinking that there should be a multilateral organization that takes in charge in technical cybersecurity. So this should be more technical body or a non-intergovernmental structure. So, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? No? Oh, go ahead, please.
I just wonder, I mean, with the multi-stakeholder approach, of course, coming from the UN, as I said, it's government to government, and those are our stakeholders. So I'm not sure they're multi, they're 193, but they're not other actors that are really coming into there in a big manner. One of the difficulties when you create institutions is the question is always, who are they accountable to? Who do they report to? Mm-hmm. I mean, who controls them? What do they do? I mean, we had an ICANN representative here today, and I know it's not a US, but it's sort of international, but is it really? I think there are a lot of questions about these issues. So when you create something, you also have to create somehow a mechanism to say they need to be accountable, or they need to report, or they need to be transparent, and I think that's sometimes what is lacking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Final question. I would note that one of the dilemmas in this, and I'm going to raise this hearing and we won't touch it, is in many instances for international activities, accountability ends up at the UN. So a dilemma for some of the things we've thought about.
We're not going to go to UN. My question is, as we look to cybersecurity, and when you look in a company, where is it located? What department does it? I think that what we need to do is more of a comment and a question, is to integrate the department or these norms that we have in the business. In other words, we need to publicize more. My work is I work a little bit with G6, G20, and G187, and Bretton Woods Committee on banking. What I do is reforming those institutions. It's a highly contentious mandate and debate. Now, as I can put forward in their agenda something related to this conference, I will reach out to you. What do you think, what are the key things that we should be putting forward? In other words, if I write right now to Merkel, I want you to do this, and she will do it. What is it? This is very contentious. So I think that's what I want to take away for myself. But on the other hand, the structure issue we have is, and I also worked on the financial infrastructure. I work on Wall Street at $50 billion a minute flow. And this is so crucial with the Federal Reserve or international. I work on international as a banker, where this is situated. So I work on very pragmatic examples where I interacted with some of you over the years. So that's a bit where I'm coming from. I apologize for being outside of, questions and more of a remarks, but that's where I would situate this.
Well, I think if we can draw that back to the themes of the panel, it's not that distant from it. We're talking really about state behavior, responsible or otherwise, and my impression is that states will do what they need to do. And we're talking about fitting that into the existing framework of state-to-state relations that govern trade and law enforcement and security. And we're talking about norms for state behavior that will apply to this new thing, to the information space, as our Russian and Chinese colleagues call it. So in that context, where would you put the balance, I think, between actions you need from the private sector, actions you need from the civil society, actions you need from states? How do you blend all that together? And does that create some kind of normative framework? I'm the moderator, so I can ask things like that and then leave it to them to answer. But go ahead. Where do we go from where we are now to get to a normative framework that increases stability, increases the security of nations? We always start with you. Go ahead.
Well, I think we already kind of covered this, and it could be just a wrap-up of the panel to say that we should put the first building blocks first, which is the state behavior, to avoid a major global cyber war type of situation. Then there are the second and third and fourth and fifth layer possibly. And I think your financial, industrial or financial services issue would be a very important part of the second layer, because it is important that the financial services are protected from malicious acts in cyberspace. But then the question might be that in this second and third and fourth layer, you might have non-state actors also participating in norms creation and also norms implementation.
Michele, you're unusually quiet.
I'm not quite sure what the question truly was. Multi-stakeholderism, all the different participants in cybersecurity. I mean, we've been debating this for 18 years. I guess my question is, why haven't we come a little bit further on this than we have before? We continue to repeat the same old aphorisms about how the private sector owns most of the pipes and civil society has a great role to play. And the cyberspace is borderless and states have a role that's fading away, and I don't believe that any of it's true. So I'm not quite sure exactly what you want from me. I mean, 18 years ago, I was out there preaching to all states that they need to systematically protect their national information infrastructures. I have 5 UN resolutions to that effect, 2 in the third committee and 3 in the second committee, enjoining states to take these systematic actions. It's still all very relevant. I don't, the question was, do we need another institution? God, no. But we do need to understand as developed states that other states do need capacity building, and I would give the U.S. government great marks for recognizing that those 2 words, which used to be verboten to say, are now something we say quite openly, that we're setting aside money and trying to reach out to many of the G77 states. We have programs in Africa. We have, we were at the forefront of the OAS Cybersecurity Initiative. I started in 2002, and we are doing our best to reach out to get states do it. I mean, obviously, there are UN organizations like the ITU-D, which had the development sector, which has been promulgating things there. I think that is a true mission of the ITU, to develop capacity and do things like that. I'm not sure what else there is to say on this particular subject.
Let me come in here, because I just want to mention 2 other aspects of what we do in the UN, and maybe it was too limiting to say we only work from state to state. One of the issues is with the Chemical Weapons Convention. The Chemical Weapons Convention, actually, there is an inspection regime of the chemical industry. And I think that we only got the Chemical Weapons Convention once the chemical industry turned around and decided that they were going to work with the international community to get an agreement, meaning getting the convention. I think that's a really important precedent. And the other important precedent we just had last year when the Arms Trade Treaty was adopted. And the Arms Trade Treaty is, again, not a disarmament treaty, it is a trade regulation, very important trade regulation. But it has provisions in there, obligations on states. And so they basically also have to report on and maybe even prohibit, if there's a human rights violation or anything of that sort, for exports to go ahead to a country that they deem is at risk of using these weapons in a manner that is not consistent with international humanitarian law. So we do have precedent, and I don't want to exclude saying that we need to get the other non-state actors in there. I think we're just a little bit too far away from it now. I wish we weren't. I mean, Michele said we've been at this for 18 years, but on the other hand, we're not quite there yet. But it needs to have a dialogue, and that dialogue just is not there yet. And I said in the very beginning, I said we need to broaden this. We need to broaden it from the 15 to the 20. We need to sort of somehow get it out there. And I think that, we in the UN or interested member states really must also help us in doing that. And one other aspect that I wanted to mention here is, for example, the analogy that I could also draw is, for example, now we don't talk anymore about the subsidiary of a firm that is headquartered in a particular country. They all incorporate in these countries, and they're like established entities, so to say. But when you think about the ships that used to fly, that used to register and still do under flags of convenience, there was a way to find with that also, to deal with that financially. So it wouldn't be kind of outside somewhere where they could not be touched. And I think there are analogies that we need to look at and say, how do we actually apply them to cyberspace?
Thank you. Sean, a final word. Yeah, that's okay.
Like Michele and others of you here at this conference, I've been thinking and writing about some of these problems since the mid-90s, and some of the same questions are still getting asked. Unfortunately, cyber criminals and other issues of security concerns aren't waiting for us. They continue to progress forward. There's always been espionage in cyberspace affecting the confidentiality of information. As I mentioned earlier, we're unfortunately seeing more disruptive activity that threatens the availability of information. And I sure hope we can answer questions from 2 decades ago, and I think we need to also start thinking about the questions that are going to be coming in future years. And one of those I want to put to you all is the integrity of information, whether in a corporate or a governmental context, needing to be able to confirm the validity of whatever information you're relying on to make decisions. And I think as we look at cybersecurity going forward, that has to be a part of the discussion. And so I welcome that joining the discussions that have already been ongoing for 2 decades.
So perhaps 2 things we could draw in conclusion are there are precedents in arms control and non-proliferation and trade in other areas that we can draw upon, not as templates that can be carried over one for one, but as guidance. And the other thing is that norms, the development of norms is the path that the international community has chosen to move ahead in cybersecurity. And so I think this has been a rich discussion of some of the issues that will come up. We are at a very early stage, and there will be a lot of work, but this is the path I think the world has chosen to take. With that, join me in thanking the panel.